Hey, and welcome to the Board Game Entrepreneur Podcast. I'm Nick Angiers. Today we're talking board game design. Now, board games have come a long way in the past 20 years, as I realized after coming back from China in 2014. I was like, whoa, what has happened in the past 10 years since I've been gone? And I admit that at the beginning I got really interested in board game design specifically. So my original idea for a business was to do something with Chinese because I had learned Chinese for a long time and I felt like I had a good grasp of how to teach it. And I'll do a deep dive into how that whole endeavor failed. But one part of that was I wanted to make board games for teaching Chinese. I made about half a dozen prototypes. So one that I got pretty far with was a dice game where instead of making words like you would in English, it was different sounds in Chinese, and there was one for the tones. So the dice were quite, I thought they were pretty logical in the way that I designed them. And it came out to be a pretty fun game. Like people who knew Mandarin or had learned it or spoke it as their native language, or people who didn't even know the language at all, they could all play, and people who were new to it with a few simple rules about how the language system works, how the phonology works, they could be making syllables. And then there was a score system which made a lot of sense and was quite simple. And it was intended to be a quick dice game, you know. You can carry it around in a little bag and then pull it out. And it was intended to be like an educational tool. So for teaching people how to it's called pinyin, and that's like the romanized version of Chinese when you use like the alphabet and then put tone marks on it. So it was intended for teaching people that. And aside from people who had no background in Chinese at all, I also found people from Taiwan. They use a different system. They know the sounds, of course, but they don't know how to write it in pinyin. So they could use that as a tool for learning it and pick it up quite quickly in a fun way. So I thought that was a cool product. And I made a couple other ones where you're on a map. It's a cooperative game, and you're making words to fight monsters. So really all like really wacky, kind of quirky ideas and different ways of looking at language learning. So that was where I started out, was trying to make games like this, and I learned all about Kickstarter and how to manufacture games and fulfill them and everything. And then I got to a point when I realized, you know, this is such a niche thing. Like, are people really going to buy a game where it's dice and you're doing pinyin? And I thought very realistically about, if I were to do a Kickstarter, how many people could I get to buy this? And I concluded that, you know, like a few hundred people would be a bit of a stretch. So I eventually kind of shelved that whole designing board games for teaching Chinese idea. I put a lot of work into it, and it was a lot of fun. But eventually I moved towards board game events, just because I thought that that's really what we need right now. There's so many great games coming out every year, every day even, designed by great people, and they can find an audience. But what I really realized is that we have tons of games, but we don't often have the time to play them, right? So people who are into games, they always have a long list of games they want to try, even games at home that they haven't gotten to yet. So I thought with events, I could set people up so that they had opportunities or even excuses to play lots of games. And I looked at the numbers for small conventions, like local conventions. You know, 100 to 500 people is kind of the target that I'm going for. Well, not kind of, that's very specifically the target that I'm going for. And it takes a few years to get one running because you just do it once a year. But the numbers actually look pretty good. And since you can systematize it, it's just a matter of expanding it each year, improving it, and so on. but it seemed a lot more realistic than putting dozens or hundreds of hours into a dice game or a board game about teaching Chinese that nobody really wanted. So I think it does take some trial and error just to find what people want. And even board game events, that's a long game if you're actually going to do it for money, especially full-time money. So I have some other entrepreneurial ideas going on that are not as fun as my board game events, but Meeple Leaf is kind of the end game that I want to get to. So the other projects I have going are more of a means to an end than anything. So I haven't really been designing board games. I do love it. It's great fun, but it's just so hard nowadays to actually get people's attention because the games out there are so good and so cool. And I stay off Kickstarter just because there's so many awesome games out there. I can't possibly buy them all. And even if I did buy like one a month, it'd be hard to get them all played, let alone played numerous times. So I think I'll leave the game design to other people and just do it for fun. Like I like doing those one-day board game jams. Two good friends of mine, Mark Ellis and Matt Mitchell, they host a series of events called Avant Card here in Vancouver. And those are great because I can scratch that design itch. I can pump out a game prototype with usually 2 or 3 people that I've never met before, so it's a great way to socialize and make friends. And then just make like a crazy design that we're not really accountable for. If it works, that's great. And if it doesn't, it doesn't really matter. That's not really the point. But it's just a fun way to be creative. Now, if I'm going to go for publishing games, either through other people or myself, there's so much work that has to go into making one of those. And I don't really have a community where I can just make a game and a lot of people will find it. So, in a very roundabout way, I really enjoy doing party games and game shows, that kind of thing. So with my board game events, I plan to host lots of game shows and that kind of thing. And I can get creative too, like I can make my own game shows. I don't have to do wits and wagers and code names every time. So if I do lots of events and hold my own game shows and eventually have a product that I think might be able to get published, well then all I have to do is put it into a publishable format, and then a lot of people have already played it. So I think for my own purposes, that would be a more reliable route to actually getting a game made, rather than just buckling down and making like a worker placement game on my own. It'll be 2 years or so before I even get something that's close to finished, and then you have to and then get it into people's hands. And then even then, like your first Kickstarter, if you don't lose money, then you probably put a lot of time into learning the game. So that's 2 years of time to not even really turn a profit. So the numbers just didn't really add up. If it were 10, 15 years ago, the very beginning of the game, things might have been different in the way that I decided to make my choice to not design games as an actual serious endeavor. But hopefully I will eventually design some games that become a real thing. For the time being, making events is a lot like designing a game, right? You have to get people to show up to play games, and also exposing people who have never played games, getting them get in the door of the hobby. I really enjoy doing that. So there's a lot of designing board game events that's a lot like designing games, if that makes any sense. Anyway, it feels similar to me. It feels like a creative process. Okay, that is it for this episode on board game design and why I don't do it. But hopefully I will get to it eventually. I think my first one will probably be a game show. Speaking of game shows, next episode I would like to tell you about the live game shows that I've been doing on a weekly basis during the past month and a half or so of the pandemic. So tune in for that. Thanks so much and happy gaming.